Welcome to the second part of this meeting, fascinating meeting. And first of all, I would like to thank my friend Bruno that he took me on board for the organization of it. It's really an interesting task, and I'm glad that we are so many people assisting to it. The second part is consecrated to prevention and impact of lifestyle on aging, on menopause, etc. The first lecture is presented by Professor Anne Gompel from Paris. You have heard already that she is the main pillar of la gynéco-médicale in France, and we all hope that she will be successful to maintain it and to export it to Switzerland. Anne is not only one of the most skilled gynecologists I know, but she is also interested in many other domains, such as cultural aspects of menopause. But today she's speaking about the impact of lifestyle versus HRT on different cancers after menopause. Anne, please.
Thank you, Martin, for this very nice introduction. Thank you, Bruno and Sylvia, for inviting me with Martin to give this talk. So I will try initially to describe the lifestyle impact on cancer and remind you, probably you know that well as well, the impact of hormone therapy on some cancer, and then I have tried to see if I could get information from the literature of interaction between lifestyle and menopause hormone therapy. So you know that lifestyle include obesity, overweight. Physical activity can be an option to counteract obesity, and you will see that it can help to decrease the burden of cancers. Smoking, of course, diet, including processed meat and vegetables and fibers, and alcohol. All these factors, and you will see that more into detail in the next slide, can contribute to modify the occurrence of cancers. So if you are interested in that purpose, in that topics, we published with the IMS, the International Menopause Society, a few years ago, a paper on oncology in midlife and beyond. And in that paper, we remind the burden, the importance, the impact on death of smoking, alcohol, obesity, and diet. As you can see here, it can impact by more than 1 million, 2 million, 6 million of deaths in the world. And the World Cancer Research Fund and the American Institute for Cancer Research stated that controlling diet, nutrition, physical activity, and BMI may lead to a decrease of cancer by 26% in the UK and almost the same in other countries around the world. And which cancer are impacted by lifestyle and HRT? Mostly colorectal cancer, but also endometrial cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and some other I will describe now, including esophageal cancer. I was very surprised to look in the recent literature to see that obesity increases esophageal cancer and that HRT can decrease esophageal cancer. And also I would like to point out that a recent paper from the Royal College of General Practitioners addressing the link between contraception, hormonal contraception, and cancer also describe a decrease in esophageal cancer with contraception, oral contraception. So this are, for me at least, new data. So here you can see worldwide the repartition, the frequency, incidence, and mortality of the various cancer. Of course, you know that breast cancer is the first one in women, And then colorectal cancer. So I will speak about breast cancer, of course, colorectal cancer, the endometrial cancer, ovarian cancer, but also, as I told you, esophagus here. So, of course, breast is the first one in numbers, but in incidence, but in terms of mortality, you know that lung cancer and colorectal cancer can also kill women in a non-negligible amount. So here you see, probably I've read this paper, which is not so recent, in the Lancet, which has addressed the question of interaction between obesity, overweight, and cancer. And as you can see on this chart, some cancers are really driven by obesity, so colon cancer, liver cancer as well. The endometrial cancer, where is it? I cannot see very well on that screen. Maybe I move on, sorry, because I cannot see very well. So yes, here the endometrial cancer is extremely dependent on obesity, a bit the ovarian cancer, kidney cancer as well, and breast cancer in postmenopausal women, as you know, but also thyroid cancer. So to better evaluate the impact of BMI, obesity, and breast cancer on, various cancer, another way to express that is the attributable fraction of cancer in a population from risk factors. So here you can see that 36% of esophageal adenocarcinoma, endometrial cancer, gallbladder cancer, and kidney cancer depends, in Canada at least, relies or depends on obesity. And in terms of absolute numbers, you can see here the numbers. Of course, the frequency, the incidence of these various cancers are not the same. So in terms of absolute numbers, among more than 5,000 cases in Canada, associated with increased BMI. The first one was the endometrial cancer, and then the breast cancer and the colon cancer. So, which cancer are impacted by hormone replacement therapy? Breast cancer, of course, and it's increased by combined hormone therapy. I will go back to that in detail later on. The endometrial cancer, it can be increased if progestin are not appropriately associated with estrogen, but I will show you from the Million Women study that combined HRT decrease the incidence of endometrial cancer in obese women. Colorectal cancer, I will show you, of course, a few data, but of course you know that hormone therapy decrease the incidence of colorectal cancer. And the ovarian cancer, in some studies, associated with a small increase in the risk. So, of course, when you speak about menopause hormone therapy, you begin always by the WHI, which is this very potent two randomized trial. The first one was in non-hysterectomized women and consists in administration of conjugated estrogen and medroxyprogesterone acetate, and another trial randomized against placebo with, in hysterectomized women with conjugated estrogen only. So this is the latest publication of the WHI on the scope of the impact of this American treatment, which is very, very different from the French one. And as you can see here, the calculation of the absolute numbers expressed by 10,000 person years here in terms of cancer. In the subgroup of women who are more concerned by menopause hormone therapy, 50 to 59 years old, there is an excess in this study of 6 breast cancer cases among 10,000 person years, but a decrease of 1 colorectal cancer, no increase in endometrial cancer because it was a continuous design regimen, combined continuous. And as you can see here, all that noise for that, less 10 deaths from total mortality in the WHI in the active group compared to the placebo group. And furthermore, in the estrogen-only trial, less breast cancer and also less mortality. But the WHI is not all the treatment, it's not the whole world. And this recent paper is a very fascinating study from Sweden. And of course, it's not a randomized trial, it's a population-based cohort study based on register. And they have gathered information on the whole woman population over 40 years old from register. And they also gathered information about systemic hormonal treatment and they look at the impact of hormone therapy on cancer. And the title of the paper is, "Do we overestimate the impact of menopause hormone therapy on cancer?" And what do they find? So globally, on all cancer, the relative risk of estrogen-only therapy is 1.4, 1.1 to 1.06. Combined HRT 1.14. Increasing breast cancer, I will show you that in the other part of the slide, endometrial and ovarian cancer, but decrease in all GI cancers, esophagus, liver, significant decrease, colon cancer. So this suggests an estimated 8.3% attributable fraction of cancer among hormonal therapy users and 1.1% population attributable fraction among all women in Sweden could be attributed to MHT. But of course, there are many other benefits. We will learn that this afternoon about cardiovascular benefits and quality of life benefits. So the price to pay in terms of cancer maybe has to be reconsidered. So what was also interesting in this publication, so they describe increase in breast cancer, 1.40. And what was interesting is to also, and there are not so many data in the literature on that, is that in older women, the burden is much more important than in younger women. So it was significant for breast cancer, always significant, but really significant in very older women over 70 years old, as well as for the endometrial cancer. For the ovarian cancer, it was just significant in all women, but not stratifying upon ages. And the colon cancer was significantly decreased in the whole population and mostly in aging women. So physical...
Please back because of the film. There's a video taken of you.
Sorry. Okay. So one way of modifying obesity, I told you, is, of course, there are two ways. There are physical activities and diet, nutrition. So as Petra told you into detail in her talk, definitely in our consultation of menopause, we try to educate women about nutrition, about lifestyle, about physical activity. So what about physical activity in the literature and its impact on cancer? So again, a recent study gathering 12 prospective US and European cohorts self-reported physical activity among more than 1 million participants. And they showed that high physical activity versus low physical activity can, as you can see here, decrease most of cancer. The only one which was significantly increase, I don't see it here, was melanoma. Maybe my slide is cut a bit. So the only one to be increased significantly is melanoma because of sun exposure when you jog and when you exercise outside. But you can see that all the GIs cancer and the gynecologist and breast cancer can be significantly decreased by physical activity, high physical activity versus low physical activity. In most papers, it seems to be important to have strenuous high activity up to 5 hours per week, which seemed to be impossible, I mean, for active women working with children and so on. But still, so I have no time to show you, but it seemed to have a linear relationship between physical activity and decrease of some cancer at least. So any physical activity would improve the weight, BMI, and also maybe cognitive disorders. You will speak maybe about that, and also well-being and quality of life. So what is the interaction between physical activity and hormone therapy? There are not so many data on that, and on that paper, in the supplementary data, they look at that, and they stratified between never users and ever users, and as you can see here, the benefit of physical activity is not opposed by hormonal therapy for lung cancer. Lung cancer, it's mostly smoking, of course, which is active. But on colon cancer, on rectal cancer, on breast cancer, and somewhere endometrial cancer, but I don't see it. Where is it? But still, it remains statistically significant. So MHT in a woman who exercises does not oppose the effect of exercise on most cancer. Of course, this study on physical activity has some limitation, also on BMI, because some are self-declared and also exercise. So now these people, in this paper, they promote new studies using accelerometers. You know that everybody now has a connected watch, and this watch helps to know if you are exercising, moving sufficiently, or 10,000 feet per day, and so and so. And probably it's also more objective measurement. So in the future, we will maybe confirm or not confirm these results. And of course, it's very difficult to raise and conduct a randomized trial on that. So also concerning mortality, which is a strong and hard endpoint, you know that it was published 2 years ago in the GCM. Meta-analysis, it's not observational study. I will not present the data from Mikola on mortality and MHT, which are observational studies with bias, but these are all coming, this meta-analysis has gathered and pooled all the randomized controlled trials. And this meta-analysis show that the hormonal treatment does not affect the risk of death. And furthermore, from 2 randomized controlled trials with mean age less than 60 years old and 3 randomized controlled trials in women who would start less than 10 years after menopause, the reduction in mortality with MHT was significant. So despite the fact that it's increased a bit some cancer, mostly breast cancer, the mortality is decreased. Also another major benefits which could interact with lifestyle is that MHT decrease the incidence of diabetes type 2 in randomized trial. Sorry, I should have put that here. And here you can see the association between the relative risk of various cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, endometrial cancer, and diabetes type 2, whether just age-adjusted or multivariate adjusted. And we know from the WHI, from the HER study, and also from the observational IFRI and French cohort study, that in women treated for by MHT, there is a decrease, significant decrease in randomized trial and observational data of the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. And we know that the estrogen are acting at the level of the secretion of insulin, preservation of beta cell trophicity, decreasing insulin resistance, and also at the brain level on oxygen and energetic expander. So these are truly extremely important beneficial effect of estrogen. So moving back to the attributable fraction of various factors in comparison between MHT and other lifestyle factors. You can see here that for the breast, the endometrium, and the colorectal cancer, obesity is definitely the first leader in increasing the risk. And MHT here is less important compared to alcohol intake and physical activity or sedentarity. So we have published that several years ago from French and other European countries data with my colleague Geneviève Plubureau, and we have looked at the attributable fraction of breast cancer, this is only concerning breast cancer, according to lifestyle and MHT and hormonal contraception. So according to country, the prevalence of, from one country to another, the prevalence of alcohol and obesity, of course, can vary. And as you can see here, MHT in France, at least using the published data from France and using, at that time it was before the figure are before the WHI, the percent of women, postmenopausal women using MHT. You can see here the relative responsibility or attributable fraction from MHT here, compare here to sedentarity, alcohol intake, and overweight, and it varies among the country. And again, addressing the question of attributable fraction in other population, here from the US, you can see here the modifiable factors after menopause. And again, BMI, increasing weight, is the major leader here, as well as sedentarity. Compare here to current MHT, which stay much beyond the other factors. So we know by several studies that in women, obese women, MHT does not increase further the risk of breast cancer. Here it's a European, from EPIC, European publication, and they have looked at the impact on MHT on breast cancer according to the presence or absence of estradiol receptor. And in that study, but we know that in European countries and in EPIC especially cohorts, most of the women are not so obese. In this group of obese women, still MHT increase a bit the risk of breast cancer, but not significant, but less significantly than in lean women here, and there is no impact on ER-negative breast cancer. So now I will rapidly speak about other cancer than the breast cancer, the colorectal cancer. So it was stated that almost a third to half of the colorectal cancer risk is attributable to lifestyle factors, such as smoking, high consumption of red and processed meat. I have no time to go into detail of these factors, obesity, diabetes, and alcohol. And here you can see from this paper a summary of 5 meta-analyses on obesity and colorectal cancer in women. As you can see, in most meta-analyses, again, obesity is strongly associated with colorectal cancer. So I don't know if you see well here, but you can see the impact of obesity on colorectal of colon cancer, physical activity here, and look here at MHT. So it's a meta-analysis published a few years ago, and they look in old publication about colon cancer, and they showed that there was a decrease of colon cancer from MHT, and it's a biphasic because actually there were very few users, current users of MHT in aging population. That's why probably the curve is going up. And here there is a linear decrease between, a relationship between colon cancer and the relative risk among former users from HRT. So apparently from this study, there is a remnant protective effect of HRT on colon cancer. Endometrial cancer, I already told you that obesity was the major factor. You know, of course, this result from the Million Women study, the observational UK study, showing here that in comparing normal weight women, overweight women, and obese women, and as you can see here, the pink column is women who never use MHT. In these women, of course, with obesity, there is an increased risk of endometrial cancer. And if you give these women continuous combined hormone therapy, then you decrease significantly the risk of endometrial cancer, as well as in overweight women, and no increase in the risk with normal weight women with continuous combined. Concerning ovarian cancer, there are some data from the literature suggesting that BMI increase ovarian cancer, not very robust, but still. But in that paper, they remind that the result for BMI on ovarian cancer did not differ by HRT use in most of large cohort, the NERCEL study, EPIC study. But the increased risk for obese women was observed only for those who did not use hormone therapy. The risk associated for ovarian cancer with obesity seems to be specific to non-serous and low-grade serous subtype, and concerning physical activity, there are null findings or risk reduction for ovarian cancer. But still, since it reduces mainly all the cancer, it's important to educate the women in that direction. And also the obesity was more active, more prevalent, more important to premenopausal ovarian cancer than postmenopausal ovarian cancer. So I will finish presenting you two modelizations about breast cancer or other cancers. By modelization from cohort, these papers try to evaluate the impact of controlling alcohol intake, physical activity, and BMI on breast cancer incidence. In this paper, they showed that in the less risky group, combining control of this lifestyle, three lifestyle patterns, could help to decrease significantly the risk of breast cancer. And from the US, it was shown quite a bit different results. They combine lifestyle, but they combine also SNPs and different data, and they show that up to 29% of all breast cancer could be prevented if all white women in the US population were at the lowest risk for the 4 modifiable risk factors, and that 1 out of 5 in the highest category of risk, and only 4% in the lower category of risk will be prevented. So these are modelizations. These are not the true life. These studies are very difficult to conduct, but still it's encouraging. And I think we have to get that in mind when we are doing our consultation with menopause women, even non-menopause women, previous menopause, of course. So my conclusion, obesity is a major factor for cancers, could have put plural. Combined hormone therapy is a risk factor for breast cancer, but can be attenuated in selecting patients and modulating other factors. The level of risk is lower for MHC and cancer, and has benefits on other endpoints, but of course we will address that later on. And again, GI cancer seems to be decreased at all the level by MHD. Thank you very much.
I think it's not working. It's working now. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. It was a brilliant lecture. We learned a lot. At least I did learn a lot. I didn't know that all GI cancers are reacting to HRT. That's a nice finding you made.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking me to cover the field, because...
Yes, you did it, really.
Thank you.
I think there's several questions to be asked. Who would like to start? Yes, up there.
They use MET per hour and MET per week, and usually strenuous exercise is jogging. Walking is not, of course. Swimming is not, except if you are in competition. So you find that in the paper, in the literature, but it's usually defined as MET per and week, and it's over 6 MET. I mean, the level, when you exercise in a gym room, you can have a device which measure the MET you produced. So it's over 6 MET. So it's usually corresponding to jogging.
Okay. Are there other questions? I was wondering about the slide you showed us, what is responsible for breast cancer in different European countries. How did the authors conclude that it was due to HRT and not to other factors?
No, of course it's not. It's just
an estimation.
Yes, exactly. It's in women who use HRT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's
HRT
all.
use simply.
So yes, I wanted to point out, but I forget. And your question is right in that sense, that the interaction between obesity, alcohol, MHD is not known. Of course, it's descriptive epidemiology. Yeah. So there are statistical tests, and I am sure that epidemiologists will say, well, we adjust on that factor and we look at interaction and we have method for that. But I do believe, as a clinician and a bit biologist, that the statistical interaction is not clinically relevant. I mean, it's not the same to give MHD to an obese woman who drink alcohol and smoke, or to a lean woman who drinks alcohol and smoke. So this interaction in the real body and real life cannot be measured by this study. Thank you for the question. Absolutely. Yeah.
If there's no other questions, we profit to continue. Thank you very much, Anne, again. The next lecture has a title, Can We Protect the Aging Brain? It will be presented by Pauline Marquis. She's a professor of psychiatry and psychology in Chicago. Thank you for coming the long way from there to Zurich. And she is, and that is rare for psychiatrists at my knowledge, a perfect endocrinologist at the same time. And this combination allows Pauline to present the data she will present today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks to Bruno, too, for inviting me today, and to Sylvia and IBSA for supporting us and for their wonderful hospitality. It's a pleasure to be here in Zurich. At this point in history, it's a pleasure to leave my country. So this is Chicago. This is where I hail from. This is the home of Barack Obama, I might say. And this is my favorite picture of the Chicago skyline because it's from before the Trump Tower went up in Chicago. So I will not update this slide, and you'll be seeing this till I'm well in my 60s. So I'm very pleased. Yes, thank you. On behalf of all the blue states, which are the states you want to visit, New York, Illinois, California, we welcome you. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about how to keep our brains healthy, which is a particular challenge in the United States right now, given all the stress. All the research that I'll be showing you from my own lab is supported by the NIH, but I did have a speaking honorarium from Milan Pharmaceuticals. So my goals today are threefold. The first is to provide an overview of the epidemiology of cognition and Alzheimer's disease in women. And the second is to describe evidence from prospective studies about what you can do to protect your brain, especially if you're female. And the third one is to describe menopause-related risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. So let's go first to the epidemiology. Why do we care about women and Alzheimer's disease? Well, first of all, we should normalize cognitive complaints. So clinically, we see a lot of women who present with cognitive complaints, and this is perfectly normal. Indeed, 60% of women will have a cognitive complaint saying that their memory is not as good as it used to be. In perimenopausal women, forgetfulness is the second most prevalent menopausal symptom. And in China, memory complaints are the third most frequent. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. Memory complaints are normal as women transition through the menopause. But is it menopause or is it aging? The study of women's health across the nation controlled for aging and found that cognitive complaints do increase in the perimenopause and in the postmenopause compared to the premenopause in a very narrow age range. So this is normal. Cognitive changes are normal. Now, when women begin to worry, and what women fear, is Alzheimer's disease, with reason. 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients in Western civilization are female. What's the primary reason? The biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is what? Older age, and women outlive men. The prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in Western countries over the age of 65 can be as high as 50%. So that means that one of the large factors, one of the major reasons why women have a higher incidence of Alzheimer's disease is because they have the benefit of longevity. So what does this translate to in terms of men versus women? Using studies from Europe, this is a Eurodem study. At age 65, women have a 1 in 6 chance of developing Alzheimer's disease during the remainder of their lifetime, compared to 1 in 11 for men. And although women fear breast cancer, women in their 60s are about twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than they are to develop breast cancer. So this issue will be very relevant when we talk about hormone therapy as well. Okay, so age is a major contributing risk factor. Is there anything we can do about this? Now, it's estimated that there are about 34 million people worldwide right now with dementia. This is a problem. Why? Because the treatments that we have for dementia do not change the disease course. They treat the symptoms of the disease. Right now, there is no pharmacotherapy to treat or prevent Alzheimer's disease. But the good news is that it does appear that lifestyle factors can make a huge difference. So we're going to talk about those. So these are data from Barnes and Yaffe looking at the projected effect if you were to reduce your risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So here we have well-established risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So everyone in this audience who practices medicine probably decreases Alzheimer's disease through one of these. So decreasing diabetes, you can see the number of Alzheimer's cases that would be prevented. These are American numbers. If you had a 10% reduction in these risk factors versus a 25% reduction. You can see that there is a substantive increase in the number of cases saved, primarily through physical inactivity, a lesson that echoes what Anne's presentation also showed. These are not mutually exclusive, however. If you combine all these risk factors, it's thought that you could prevent as much as half of the cases of Alzheimer's disease worldwide. Practically speaking, you die of something else, not dementia. Okay, so what about these lifestyle factors? Well, if one looks at the epidemiological literature, women can bear a higher burden of several of these risk factors, including higher BMI, higher rates of depression, lower rates of exercise, this is actually worldwide, higher cholesterol levels, and a greater risk of Alzheimer's disease due to the primary genotype, which is ApoE4. So let's look at some of the data. So if we look here at the individual effects of these risk factors at midlife, we always turn to Scandinavia for these countries because they have 20 to 30 years of follow-up in a cohort. These are prospectively gathered data. They're the highest quality in the dementia field. So if you have a body mass index greater than 30, greater than 40 is possible in the US too, you get twice the risk of dementia compared to those who are not obese. So a twofold increased risk in dementia. Here you have similar rates for hypertension, similar rates for systolic blood pressure. The good news is that an education protects the brain against Alzheimer's disease. Now, are these factors mutually exclusive? Again, they are not. If you have one of those risk factors, your risk is slightly elevated. If you have two, there is a threefold risk. If you have three of those risk factors, there is a sixfold increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So these are not additive, they're multiplicative, they're synergistic. Now, it would seem that being thin would be a good thing for Alzheimer's disease prevention. And in fact, although we know that an increase in body mass index over 30 doubles the risk, there's also new data to suggest that being underweight is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So low normal to normal body weight is key. And again, exercise contributes to the better body mass index, but I'll describe how exercise independently is beneficial for the brain. Now, many people are concerned about Alzheimer's disease risk because they have this genetic predisposition in their family, the apolipoprotein E4 allele, ApoE4. And that can be thought of as a deterministic risk factor in the minds of lots of patients. What I like to reinforce in this area is that exercise actually is differentially beneficial for the brain if you carry the gene. So far from being ineffective if you have the genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, exercise is particularly effective. So lifestyle changes are beneficial regardless of whether you have the gene, the ApoE4 allele, or not for Alzheimer's disease. So let's talk about this genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. You might have seen in JAMA last week a meta-analysis on sex differences in the risk of Alzheimer's disease with this ApoE4 allele. And what you can see here is the earliest evidence that there is the risk factor in women that isn't present in men. So there are 3 isoforms of the ApoE genotype. You can get a 2, 3, or 4. You get one from each parent. Having a 4 doubles your risk of dementia. Having 2 of them is 6-fold increased risk of dementia. So it's a well-known late life risk factor for dementia. There are other genetic risk factors for dementia, the presenilins that affect your risk of early onset dementia, but these run in families, so people generally know whether or not they carry this early onset Alzheimer's disease. So that's to say that the ApoE4 is the gene that we care most about for the typical onset of Alzheimer's disease. And it turns out that this risk factor is more significant in women than in men. Now, this may pertain specifically to certain ages, as was suggested in the meta-analysis. It may be particularly for women who are at midlife. But it's very interesting that this genetic effect does not appear to be explained by women's longevity. Okay? So while we think about age differences, the longevity factor playing into women's higher prevalence of Alzheimer's disease, it may also be a greater genetic susceptibility to the same gene. Okay, so what can you do? Okay, so one thing that you might be doing right now is good for your brain. That's novelty-seeking ideas. So if you engage, if you engage in novelty-seeking activities, these are not a problem in Switzerland, speaking multiple languages, trying something novel for your brain, not working on your expertise, but really stretching your new learning capacity, that turns out to be very beneficial for the brain. What you will do after my talk, which you're looking forward to over lunch, you will exchange ideas with your colleagues. This is very good for the brain. It requires working memory and an active engagement. And in fact, social isolation is one of the highest risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Social networks buffer against Alzheimer's disease. Now, one thing we know is particularly bad is television watching. So watching too much television during the day is associated with an 30% increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. There are data in the United States that show from the Nielsen ratings that women as they age watch more television than men. If Trump's on the news, this is doubled. Now, what do randomized trials tell us about lifestyle factors? We're often asked about diet. So the very, very good news is that there is a dietary way of preventing Alzheimer's disease that's actually based on randomized trials. And that's the Mediterranean diet when it's supplemented by olive oil. In fact, the data were so good that they ended the trial early. Okay, we know that for cardiovascular disease too. So adhering to a Mediterranean diet is associated with a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease based on meta-analyses. Same thing for Tai Chi. And it's probably regulation of stress that's associated with the benefits of Tai Chi, as well as some of the benefits to physical activity. One other signal that's come out in the randomized trial literature is for soy isoflavones. Now, soy produces an estrogen, a phytoestrogen, that binds weakly to estrogen receptor beta. So that's one potential way that it could be beneficial for the brain. But the other way is that when we're eating soy-based diets, we're eating less red meat. So it's a food substitution approach too. But that's what the meta-analyses tell us. Now let's talk about women in particular and reproductive aging, in the area that I do most of my work in. And that is, how does the fact that women transition through menopause impact how their brain ages? So it used to be thought that the two symptoms of menopause were hot flashes and vaginal dryness. In fact, the National Institutes of Health put together an expert panel, and this is what they came out with. Well, it's the case now that we know that there's another menopause symptom that's been objectively demonstrated, and that's cognitive problems. So we know from now 3 prospective studies, the study of women's health across the nation, the Pan-Ovarian Aging study, and the Women's Interagency HIV study from the controls, that there is, in prospective studies, when you follow a woman from the time that she's premenopausal to postmenopausal, as she's entering the menopause, there's a decrease in her memory capacity. It's measurable on objective tests. So this isn't just a cognitive complaint. These are data from the Pan-Ovarian Aging study. You can see that these changes begin late in the reproductive period. So right before the onset of perimenopause, you can begin to see a decrease from the premenopause in memory capacity. This becomes highly significant in the early menopausal transition when menstrual cycles are changing in length, becomes most significant when women are skipping menstrual periods, and then it appears to revert. So it appears to go back to normal. So this is controlling for age, and in fact, the study of women's health across the nation also showed that these cognitive problems are time limited, that they do not persist beyond the postmenopausal period on average. So what is the reason for this? Well, one hypothesis is that it has to do with circulating levels of estradiol and the changes in circulating estradiol that occur during the natural menopause. What's the strongest data to support that? The data come from studies of surgically menopausal women, or women who've undergone oophorectomy. So we know from work that began in the late 1980s that when you remove a woman's ovaries, she experiences a decline in verbal memory, that is her ability to remember stories, words, grocery lists, what I'm saying right now, that she experiences that decline, and that decline is completely reversible if you treat her with estrogen therapy. So that's some very strong evidence. The second experimental evidence from the clinical environment comes from studies of Lupron, or leuprolide acetate, where if you administer Lupron to a woman, she will experience a decline in her memory that is completely reversible with add-back estrogen therapy. This issue of memory appears to be particularly sensitive. Other cognitive abilities like concentration and attention don't take that big of a hit. Memory in particular. In our work, which I won't show you right now, using neuroimaging suggests that this is from effects on the hippocampus, that estrogen therapy is very good for the hippocampus. Walter Roca demonstrated that women who have their ovaries removed earlier than menopause, very important, before the age of 48, have a 70% increased risk of cognitive impairment or dementia during the remainder of their lifetime. Danish data replicated this finding. The good news is that this too is preventable with the use of estrogen therapy, so that among women who went on estrogen therapy following early oophorectomy, this risk was completely gone. It prevented that increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, our work in the last few months is focused on another potentially preventable contributor to memory decline, and that's hot flashes. So for many years, people have measured hot flashes with diaries and with questionnaires, and then they've examined the number of hot flashes women have, and they've tied this to performance on memory tests. Now let's think about that design for a little bit. You're asking women to remember how many hot flashes they had, and then you're testing their memory. That's not the best experimental design that you can have. We know that women underreport their hot flashes in real life. How do we know that? Well, this is through studies of what we call physiologic or objectively measured hot flashes. So this is a biolog monitor. This is a US quarter. Women wear this in a pouch around their belt. It has 2 electrodes that are attached to the sternum, and those electrodes show a typical characteristic wave, an increase in skin conductance when a woman has a hot flash. And what it's picking up on is sweating on the surface of the skin. Now, these monitors measure these physiologic hot flashes. At the same time, a woman can press those 2 buttons when she thinks she's having a hot flash. So it's a real-time measure. It doesn't require memory. A real-time measure of her hot flashes. So how do we know that these are really hot flashes? Well, we know it because in individuals who have swallowed radiotelemetry pills that pick up on core body temperature, there's a very high correlation, 0.98, between the changes in core body temperature and these changes on the surface of the skin. We know that women underreport their hot flashes by they only detect about 65% of the hot flashes that are detected by those monitors. This has been replicated many, many times. Another reason that we think that they're picking up on real hot flashes is by looking at the placebo effect. So we know that in randomized trials, we can give women a variety of different interventions, and even if they're inactive, if they're a placebo, if they're a sham, a stellate ganglion blockade, whatever intervention you're testing, women will show a placebo effect on the number of reported hot flashes. So illustrating this from one of our randomized trials where we had a 4-arm randomized trial over a year. We had women randomized to placebo, and you can see that at baseline they were reporting 20 hot flashes per week, and you can see this decrease in hot flashes, even though they were randomized to receive nothing but a sugar pill. You can see this reduction in red clover with black cohosh and with CEMPA. Now, this is the same women on the monitors. The placebo group showed no increase, no change whatsoever. right? So you can't will the objective hot flashes away. You see a similar number of hot flashes. You see red clover took away a little bit, black cohosh a little bit, and Prempro took away almost all of them. So this suggests to us that we're measuring something valid as well when we're looking at these physiologic hot flashes. Now, the striking finding that we had some years ago now in 2008 is that when you correlated the number of self-reported hot flashes with memory performance in women, there was no correlation, none at all. And many others have found that too. However, if you looked at the number of hot flashes picked up on the monitor with memory performance, there was a strong negative linear effect. The more objective hot flashes a woman was having, the worse her memory. Now, what confounding factor do we worry about? She said, having come over to Zurich from the United States on an overnight flight, sleep, right? So when a woman wakes up from hot flashes, her sleep's disturbed. What's interesting is these findings seem to hold even when you control for sleep. That is, sleep contributes to worse memory performance, but hot flashes remain a significant predictor of memory performance even when you take sleep into account. So that's correlational. How do you test it from a causal way? Well, this is difficult. I can't give women estrogen and see whether or not taking away their hot flashes improves their memory, because there's evidence that estrogen itself improves their memory, right? So you need a treatment that decreases the objective hot flashes but doesn't affect memory directly. And so one of those treatments is a stellate ganglion blockade. So this is an anesthesia procedure that involves injection of bupivacaine in the C6 vertebrae. Our group published the first sham-controlled trial of it, hypothesis supporting. It took away 50% of moderate to severe hot flashes when compared to sham control. We're running a bigger trial now. But from my perspective, what was more interesting is that the extent to which the stellate ganglion blockade took away objective hot flashes, which it did, it also improved memory. So this is the change, this is the change in objective hot flashes from baseline to post-treatment and the improvement in memory. So the women who experienced the greatest symptom relief from the treatment for hot flashes experienced the greatest improvement in memory. So why would hot flashes have a negative effect on memory? Every time a woman has a hot flash, she has a surge in glucocorticoids, a surge in cortisol. Women in many of our studies were experiencing more than 10, more than 15 hot flashes a day. So what that means is that basically her brain was being bathed in cortisol. If I were to inject that amount of cortisol into you and to test your memory performance would be greatly impaired. So cortisol impairs memory at that dose. So that's our working hypothesis. That coupled with the idea that the woman probably is experiencing worse sleep. Now, those data held only for the physiologic hot flashes. We also took this hypothesis to our neuroimaging studies, and this is work done in collaboration with my good colleague Rebecca Thurston at the University of Pittsburgh. So in these studies, we asked the question, what is the relationship between hot flashes, when we measure them with these monitors, and brain structure and brain function? Okay, so on the left, what we're seeing here is the brain structure. And what you see are white matter hyperintensities, these periventricular masses here, these ischemic lesions, which are a natural part of aging. We see these in most people as they age. But what we found is a linear relationship between the number of hot flashes a woman showed on these monitors and the number of white matter hyperintensities in the brain. Now, this held when you controlled for all the cardiovascular risk factors that one typically thinks of. So we didn't control for carotid IMT. That's what we're doing in our current study. So this was based on a sample of fewer than 50 women. We're now testing to see if this is robust in a sample of 350 women. So invite me back in 5 years, I might have some data to show you. So that's brain structure, worst ischemic burden. The other thing that we care about is brain function. So there is this construct in neuroimaging research called the default mode network. And the default mode network is where your brain might be right now if you're not really listening to me and you're not really doing anything at all and you're just kind of wandering. It is the natural state of your brain when you're not engaging in any particular cognitive activity. It used to be that we thought that if you wanted to understand how the brain was functioning, you would measure the brain activity when people were engaging in a task. So for example, my early neuroimaging work had women engage in a memory task in the brain. What we've learned in the last 10 years is that what your brain is doing right now, because it's just really not doing anything at all, what your brain is doing right now is a very strong predictor of your risk for Alzheimer's disease. It kind of tells you the resting state of your brain. And what we found is that the more hot flashes women had generally, and even more so if you looked at sleep-related hot flashes, the more her brain activity was altered. That is, her hippocampus was working harder in relation to the number of hot flashes she had. So in other words, our studies to date suggest that the more physiologic hot flashes you have, the worse your memory performance, the worse your brain structure, and the worse your brain function. So we're looking to replicate these data right now, and we'll see what happens. Now, what about hormone therapy? Is hormone therapy good for your brain? Well, if you talk to WHI people, it's a risk factor for memory decline. Is it protective? If you speak to most Europeans, they'll say yeah. Is it neutral or does it depend? So I'm in the depend category. It depends on a number of factors. So we know the critical window or critical period hypothesis or the timing hypothesis. We know it from the cardiovascular literature, but it also has been studied in memory studies and hormone therapy. So the idea is that the neuroprotective effects of hormone therapy depend on the timing of hormone therapy in relation to either age or onset of menopause, and that the earlier one uses it, the more beneficial it will be. Okay? Just like the cardiovascular one that Hannah will probably tell you about. Now the good news is that we now have 3 excellent quality, large-scale, randomized trials of early postmenopausal women that demonstrate that in contrast to the WHI, which showed this doubling of the risk of dementia in women randomized to hormone therapy, that was in older women. These studies show uniformly and robustly that there's no cognitive harm to women who take hormone therapy between the ages of 50 and 60. So that idea that came from the WHI that hormone therapy causes dementia does not seem to be sustained if you allow yourself to look at memory performance as a proxy for dementia. The more interesting of these findings was the Women's Health Initiative memory study in younger women, which actually showed the same thing. So this is WHI data that showed that among women who were randomized to either conjugated equine estrogen or conjugated equine estrogen and medroxyprogesterone acetate, that both groups showed cognitively neutral effects, no difference from placebo. But the larger epidemiological literature suggests that hormone therapy decreases the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 39%. So how do we reconcile that? Was that epidemiological literature wrong? One striking gap in these findings is that they were done on women who didn't have vasomotor symptoms. Okay, so those were not studies in women for whom you prescribe hormone therapy. Those were studies done in healthy women. The other thing that we know is that if you look at what the predictors of Alzheimer's disease are, memory performance is a good proxy, but it's certainly not our best. The best proxy that we have is to use positron emission tomography or PET imaging of beta amyloid. That is neuritic plaques that are the cardinal neuropathology hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So Cahal Kantarsi at the Mayo Clinic did a nested neuroimaging study in KEEPS. And what she found is very positive news for hormone therapy. That is, if you measured the amount of beta amyloid in the brains of women who were randomized to transdermal estradiol in that study, they were significantly reduced when compared to placebo. So it's the first neuroimaging study to be done in this manner, and they just got word 2 weeks ago that they were funded to be continued. So they will be able to image these women longitudinally. This was after about 5 years of therapy. But the data suggests that this benefit is observed, and it's primarily in women who are carriers of that genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So again, we think about these genetic risk factors as being possibly deterministic, but hormone therapy, like exercise, particularly transdermal estradiol, not conjugated equine estrogen, was associated with benefits on this important biomarker. Now, what about Alzheimer's disease? To date, there have been 3 studies of the timing hypothesis, and all 3 support the timing hypothesis with respect to Alzheimer's disease. But unfortunately, we don't have a clinical trial to support that. Now, the Finnish study from Tommi Mikkola's group also supported this, found a significant reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease, but vascular dementia was reduced even more. But the answer is not yet clear in terms of hormone therapy and menopause and what we know about whether or not that can help to protect the brain for several reasons. The main thing is I showed you literature that suggests that one of the cardinal symptoms of menopause, the hot flush, is associated with worse memory performance, worse brain structure, and worse brain function. To date, there has not been a large-scale randomized trial of any hormone therapy product on cognition in women with moderate to severe vasomotor symptoms. So we have no idea from randomized trials how well it treats memory performance. We don't know how it impacts women in the perimenopause. We know that women who were on oral contraceptives during the perimenopause had better brain function later in life than women not on oral contraceptives. We know that from the study of women's health across the nation, multi-ethnic cohort study, but this has not been studied in a randomized trial. I have some neuroimaging data that shows that such women actually have better hippocampi as they age as well. That was work done in collaboration with Lorraine Dennerstein. We will soon know, based on the KEEPs, whether or not hormone therapy does in fact have a beneficial effect on the brain in terms of Alzheimer's pathology. We'll know that through continued neuroimaging studies, and we'll see whether or not there is this specific special transdermal estradiol effect, in which case the French will have been right all along. And then we don't know, and I think this is a particularly important question, whether or not hormone therapy is effective in preventing cognitive decline in women who undergo early surgical menopause. And that is an important question, particularly in women who are BRCA positive and who undergo early menopause. We're studying this question, Martha Hickey and I, in a cohort in Australia. So in summary, we know that complaints of cognitive decline are very common. We know that women also show a change in memory performance as they transition through the menopause. We know that this appears to rebound. One factor that's emerged that might contribute to this decline in memory is the hot flash, but we also know that changes in estradiol contribute to memory problems in women. Somehow the brain adapts to both hot flashes and to this change in gonadal steroid hormones. We know that the modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease appear to work even in individuals who are ApoE4 positive, who have the genetic risk of Alzheimer's. They're the usual suspects. Exercise more, engage in good intellectual activities, maintain your cardiovascular health, perhaps change a diet to be more of a Mediterranean diet supplemented by soy, and engage in relaxing activities like Tai Chi. Also, the evidence suggests that early use of hormone therapy might alter the risk of Alzheimer's disease. We know that contrary to some of the concerns, and this is perhaps most relevant for your patients when you prescribe hormone therapy, the concerns about dementia increasing in women who got hormone therapy early in life are not justified. We have 3 very good trials showing it has neutral effects. And in fact, we have trial data now suggesting that it may in fact have a long-term benefit for offsetting some of the neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease. Critically, we need studies of how hormone therapy might improve memory in women with moderate to severe hot flashes. We don't know the answer to that. All right, I thank you for your attention. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Pauline. It was fantastic to listen to your lecture.
Thanks.
And to see what is known, what is not known, because there's a huge confusion if you look at the literature available to normal people as we are.
Yes.
I think that one of the problems of WIMS was that they mixed all forms of dementia together. They didn't distinguish between Alzheimer or the dementias, so in fact you cannot conclude anything.
Yeah, so the Women's Health Initiative memory study, that was the randomized trial nested within the WHI to study the effects of those two combination therapies on the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Because the study was ended earlier, they post hoc changed their outcome measure to be all-cause dementia. So it wasn't Alzheimer's disease. The majority of the cases were in fact Alzheimer's disease. Next was a multi-infarct or vascular dementia. But they did have to change that outcome measure, so that's true. However, I would caution that I do believe the results from WHI in terms of initiating hormone therapy de novo in an older woman, at least those two forms of hormone therapy, because there's long-term neuroimaging follow-up data showing that the brain structure of the women who were randomized to receive hormone therapy later in life, mean age 72, was much worse, significantly worse, than in women who were randomized to receive placebo. In contrast, in support of the French, I would say that the data on transdermal estradiol, the observational data, and the randomized trial data doesn't seem to show any harm for those forms of hormone therapy, even when they're given to an older woman. And that's, I should caution, that's with estrogen alone. Okay, so they may very well be safe, and this is an issue because we now know that as many as 15% of women continue to have moderate to severe vasomotor symptoms as they age. So how do we treat them? Can we treat them safely? That's an important question.
Okay. If you have some specific questions, yes, Anne, please.
Great talk as usual. I have two questions. The first one, do we know that if patients with Cushing disease have more cognitive disorders? Because I didn't know that on that. And the second question is about depression. I don't remember if it is the SWAN study, but I think so, showing a peak of depression during menopausal transition and then stop after. So is there any interaction with the cognitive
such an important
disorder?
question. So the first question was about Cushing's disease. So if glucocorticoids are bad for the brain, then individuals with Cushing's syndrome should have worse cognitive function. And in fact, they do. And their cognitive problems go away following surgical intervention. So that, in fact, is a very good model for glucocorticoid toxicity, being bad for the brain. I will say that in all of these studies, ideally we would want cerebrospinal fluid levels of glucocorticoids and of estrogen, but nobody does that. So all these levels are peripheral, and we don't really know what the brain levels are. This is an issue because the brain produces its own estrogen, right? So that's an issue. And then the second question was about depression in the menopausal transition. So the study of women's health across the nation, the Penn Ovarian Aging Study, the Massachusetts Aging Study, and other cohort studies have followed large groups of women from premenopause to postmenopause and have done clinical diagnostic interviews of major depressive disorder. They found that the risk of major depressive disorder more than doubles during the menopausal transition and then appears to taper off in 3 of those studies, but not in the SWAN. So the SWAN is an outlier. So the study of women's health across the nation suggests that that risk is maintained. And that, by the way, is the largest study. So we don't know if that goes away. You would think that somebody would have studied whether or not there's a relationship between menopause-related depression and Alzheimer's disease later in life. That study has not been done. That's something we're proposing to do in the SWAN. I think it's a very important one. We know from Claudio Suarez's work that hormone therapy also improves mood in the perimenopausal women and in postmenopausal women. So that too is, in theory, a preventable cause of Alzheimer's disease, and one that's very important for women, since women have twice the risk of major depressive disorder compared to men.
Am I right that depression may be an early symptom of Alzheimer's disease?
Yes, so this is a really important question too. In these studies, it's really important to distinguish between, say, midlife depression, depression when you're in your early 50s, for example, and depression at around age 65, because depression can be the presenting symptom of Alzheimer's disease. We think about Alzheimer's disease as being a memory disorder, but very often it's personality changes and mood changes and other behavioral changes that are the more obvious sign in people. So yeah, that's an issue as well. So the work in SWAN is very important because this shows this midlife risk factor. Ray Ownby did a meta-analysis where he restricted midlife depression studies. He showed that it's like a 1.7-fold increased risk compared to those who are not depressed. That risk goes down by about 25% in women who've been on SSRIs. So that could be beneficial too.
Last question.
Yeah.
Excellent overview. I have one question. You talked a lot about risks and decline in risks and so on. But what does it mean in terms of number? For example, with regard to 10,000 postmenopausal women changing their lifestyle habits, how many would really profit from that?
So the question is, what's the real impact of this? Is it a tiny one or is it a large one? So the Barnes and Yaffe study suggested that if you addressed the lifestyle factors that were in that initial slide, you could reduce the risk of the incidence of Alzheimer's disease by 50%. So it's substantive. It means you'll die of something else, right? You're just, essentially, you're pushing off the age of onset in Alzheimer's disease, right?
Excuse me, we all do not know, will we develop Alzheimer?
That's right.
So my question is, again, what does it mean with regard to number? From 1,000 women, how many would develop Alzheimer?
Oh, how many would develop?
Yeah. And then it's 50%.
Yeah, so Alzheimer's disease is the 10th leading cause of death in women. According to the WHO, a woman will have a 1 in 11 chance at age 65. And for example, hormone therapy, if they're correct, will take away 30% of that risk. And the lifestyle factors would take away 50% of that risk. But hormone therapy probably operates in part through cardiovascular risk reduction, right? So they're not mutually beneficial. I haven't seen the hard calculations like Anne has done where you take all the other factors into consideration, but it's a worthwhile endeavor. 50% is something to strive for. Yeah.
Yeah, quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have to stop the general discussion, but to continue, of course, Pauline stays here to ask her directly.
Okay.
Lunch is just outside. We will be back all here at 2 o'clock pile. Thank you very much. Have a good lunch. I was